Money buys silence, but it cannot buy a spine. When Boston's most feared crime boss publicly shamed a plus-size waitress for her weight, he expected tears and apologies. Instead, she tossed her apron in his face and ignited a war that would burn his empire and his frozen heart to the ground. Katherine Gallagher was fat. She did not use words like curvy, voluptuous, or thick to soften the reality of her body. At a size 24, B took up space in a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves. But what she lacked in societal privilege, she made up for in a relentless, unbreakable work ethic. For 3 years, she had been the backbone of Antonelli's Trattoria, a high-end, old-money Italian restaurant tucked away on Hanover Street in Boston's North End. It was a Tuesday night in late November when the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from pleasantly bustling to suffocatingly tense. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amos Costello had arrived. Amos wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was the head of the Costello Syndicate, a ruthless Mafia faction that controlled the docks, the local unions, and half the judges in Suffolk County. He was 34, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit, and possessed a gaze so cold it could freeze boiling water. Flanked by his underboss, Lorenzo, and 2 massive enforcers, Amos bypassed the hostess stand entirely and claimed the sprawling corner booth, a table normally reserved for City Councilman Richard Hayes, who quietly scurried to the bar the moment he saw the mobster walk in. "B, you take them," Mr. Antonelli whispered, his face slick with nervous sweat. He shoved a leather-bound menu into her hands. "Don't look him in the eye. Pour the wine, take the order, and step back." B wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath that strained the buttons of her white uniform shirt, and nodded. She had dealt with arrogant men before. She navigated the narrow aisles of the restaurant, her wide hips brushing against the backs of mahogany chairs. She approached the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with a bottle of the 2015 Sassicaia?" Amos interrupted, not even glancing up from his phone. "And bring the antipasto. Quickly." Bear nodded, retreating to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a heavy silver tray laden with imported meats, cheeses, and the $400 bottle of wine. As she approached the corner booth, Amos's enforcer, a hulking man named Paulie, suddenly shoved his chair back without looking. The heavy wooden chair slammed directly into B's hip. The impact threw her off balance. Her heavy frame twisted, her rubber-soled shoes skidding on the polished hardwood. She fought to save the tray, but gravity was unforgiving. The bottle of Sassicaia tipped, slipped, and shattered against the edge of the table. A wave of deep crimson wine splashed directly onto Amos Costello's lap, soaking his silk tie and ruining his trousers. The entire restaurant went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Amos slowly stood up, wine dripping from his jacket onto the pristine white tablecloth. He looked down at the mess, then slowly raised his dark, unforgiving eyes to B. She was flushed, her chest heaving as she scrambled to grab a cloth napkin. "I am so incredibly sorry, sir," B said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. She reached out to dab the table. "I was bumped, but I will get this cleaned up immediately and bring another—" "Don't touch me," Amos snarled, his voice a low, lethal vibration that echoed in the quiet room. He stepped back, looking B up and down with absolute, visceral disgust. He didn't just look at her, he dissected her. He looked at her thick waist, her heavy thighs, and the sweat beading on her forehead. "Antonelli!" Amos barked, not breaking eye contact with B. The owner materialized in seconds, trembling. "Mr. Costello, I apologize. If you're going to hire livestock to serve your food, Antonelli, you need to widen the aisles," Amos said, his voice carrying clearly to every table in the room. Look at her. She's a pig at a trough, knocking over furniture because she's too fat to squeeze through a dining room. It's pathetic." A cruel snicker erupted from Lorenzo. A few patrons looked away in second-hand embarrassment. Bea froze. She was used to the subtle cruelties of the world, the eye rolls on airplanes, the condescending tones of sales clerks. But this was a public execution. The cruelty was deliberate, designed to strip away her humanity. Amos waited for her to break. He waited for the tears to well up, for her to drop her gaze and run to the kitchen in a blubbering mess. That was what people did when Amos Costello destroyed them. Instead, Bea stood up straight. She smoothed down her apron over her wide hips. The blush faded from her cheeks, replaced by an icy, terrifying calm. "The chair hit me, Mr. Costello," Bea said, her voice ringing out clear and unapologetic. Amos's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "Your man pushed his chair into my hip. That's why the tray fell," Bea continued, staring directly into the dark, violent eyes of Boston's most dangerous man. "I apologized for the spill because it is my job to be polite. But I will not stand here and let a grown man throw a temper tantrum and insult my body because a chair got moved." Antonelli gasped. Lorenzo reached inside his jacket, his hand resting on his holster. Amos was entirely paralyzed by shock. Nobody spoke to him like this. Not rival bosses, not the chief of police, and certainly not a fat waitress in a cheap uniform. Bea reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small wad of cash, her entire tip earnings from the night, and slammed a $50 bill onto the table. "For the dry cleaning," Bea said coldly, "though I doubt any amount of soap will wash the garbage out of your personality." She turned, untied her apron, and tossed it directly onto Amos's ruined plate of antipasto. Without another word, Katherine Gallagher walked out of the front door of the restaurant, her head held high, leaving the ruthless Don standing in a puddle of wine, completely, utterly speechless. The retaliation was swift, though Amos barely had to lift a finger. By 8 a.m. the next morning, Bea received a panicked phone call from Mr. Antonelli. She was fired. Not only was she fired, but Antonelli had called every restaurant owner in the North End and warned them that hiring Katherine Gallagher meant a brick through their front window and a visit from the health inspector. Or worse. Amos Costello sat in his leather armchair in his penthouse overlooking the Boston harbor, swirling a glass of scotch. He was a man who operated on control. If an associate stole from him, they disappeared. If a debtor missed a payment, their business burned down. Punishment was simple math, but Katherine Gallagher was a variable he couldn't calculate. For 3 days, the image of her standing in front of him, unapologetic and fierce, burned in his mind. He had humiliated her in front of 50 people. He had called her a pig. He had attacked the very thing society told women to be most ashamed of. She should have crumbled. Instead, she had looked at him with utter pity and paid him for the privilege. "Lorenzo," Amos said, not turning away from the window. "Where is the waitress?" Lorenzo paused, clearing his throat. Antonelli canned her, blacklisted her in the neighborhood. She's currently facing eviction from her apartment on Tremont Street. "She's broke, boss." "Good," Amos muttered. "Is she begging for her job back?" "No, boss. She took the tea down to Southie. Got a job working the graveyard shift at O'Rourke's Diner on Dorchester Avenue, scrubbing grills and pouring coffee." Amos's grip on his glass tightened. A greasy spoon in South Boston. She was working from midnight to 8 in the morning, just to avoid crawling back to the North End. The stubbornness infuriated him. It felt like a direct challenge. She was a fat, broke nobody, and she was refusing to break. "Get the car," Amos ordered. It was 2 a.m., when the sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled up outside O'Rourke's diner. The neon sign buzzed and flickered in the freezing rain. Amos stepped out alone, telling his men to stay in the vehicle. The bell above the door chimed as he walked in. The diner smelled of stale fry oil and cheap bleach. There were only 2 patrons, a drunk sleeping in a booth and a truck driver nursing a black coffee. And there was Bea. She was behind the counter, wearing a stained yellow uniform that stretched tightly across her broad back. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she was aggressively scraping burnt grease off the flat-top grill with a heavy metal spatula. She didn't look up when the door chimed. Amos walked to the counter and sat on one of the cracked vinyl stools. He placed his hands flat on the formica surface. Bea turned around to ask for his order, the spatula still in her hand. When she saw him, she stopped. Her expression didn't change to fear. It didn't change to anger. It simply settled into bone-deep exhaustion. "We don't serve sassicaia here, Mr. Costello," Bea said flatly. "Just drip coffee and regret." "I didn't come for the coffee," Amos said smoothly, leaning forward. He examined her face. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were red and blistered from the hot water and grill chemicals. Good, he thought. She's suffering. "I came to see how the other half lives. Antonelli tells me you're struggling to make rent." "Mr. Antonelli is a coward who gossips like a schoolgirl," Bea replied, pouring herself a glass of ice water. She leaned her heavy hips against the back counter. "Did you drive all the way to South Boston in the rain just to gloat? Because if so, you need a hobby." Amos's jaw tightened. "I can make this stop, Katherine. I can make a phone call right now, and you can have your cushy job at Antonelli's back. Hell, I could buy you a restaurant." Bea took a sip of her water. "And what's the catch?" "I don't like disrespect," Amos said, his voice dropping into that dangerous velvety tone that usually made men start writing their wills. "But I admire resilience. You have fire. I don't date fat girls, but I have a proposition for you. You agree to be available to me, on my terms, behind closed doors, and you'll never scrub a grill again. You apologize for the stunt you pulled with the money, and your life gets very, very comfortable." He expected her to be insulted, maybe throw hot coffee at him. But what she did was infinitely worse. Katherine set her glass down and started laughing. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a deep, belly-shaking, genuine laugh that echoed off the cheap tin ceiling of the diner. Amos's blood ran cold. "What is funny?" he demanded, his ego cracking. Bea wiped a tear of mirth from her eye and leaned across the counter, bringing her face inches from his. "You," she whispered, shaking her head. "You are pathetic. You run a criminal empire. You have politicians in your pocket and men who kill on your command. And yet, your fragile little ego was so shattered by a fat waitress refusing to cry for you that you stalked me to a diner at 2 a.m. to try and buy my submission." Amos opened his mouth, but no words came. "You don't want me, Amos," Bea continued, her voice softening into something that sounded dangerously like pity. "You want to break me, because you are surrounded by yes-men and terrified cowards, and I am the only person in your miserable, violent life who looked at you and wasn't afraid. I don't care about your money. I don't care about your power, and I certainly don't want your charity." She picked up a damp rag and began wiping the counter right in front of him, dismissing him entirely. "Now," she said, not looking at him, "are you going to order a grilled cheese, or are you going to get out of my diner so I can finish my shift?" Amos Costello, the most ruthless don in Chicago's sister syndicate and Boston's undisputed king, sat frozen. For the first time in his life, he had fired his best weapon, and it had bounced off a woman whose armor was made of pure, unapologetic self-worth. He slowly stood up, the silence ringing in his ears, and walked out into the rain. He had come to break her. But as he sat in the back of his Lincoln, his chest tight and his mind racing with the image of her defiant, beautiful eyes, Amos realized a terrifying truth. She had just broken him. For 3 weeks, the routine remained unbroken. At exactly 2 a.m., the black Lincoln Navigator would pull up to O'Rourke's diner. Amos Costello would walk in alone, sit at the third stool from the register, and order a black coffee. He never spoke to Bea. He never made another crude proposition. He simply sat in the flickering fluorescent light and watched her work. Bea ignored him. She wiped down the counters, took orders from the night shift truckers, and scrubbed the grill. She didn't put on makeup. She didn't suck in her stomach when she squeezed past the narrow space between the fryer and the prep station. She existed entirely on her own terms, occupying her space with a solid, unbothered grace that drove Amos absolutely out of his mind. He was losing his grip on his empire, and everyone in the Boston underworld knew it. Lorenzo, his underboss, had warned him twice that the Irish factions in Charlestown, specifically Mickey Callahan, a brutal remnant of the old Winter Hill boys, were noticing Amos's late-night, unguarded excursions to Southie. A Don without his security detail was a Don begging to be usurped, but Amos couldn't stop. He was a man dying of thirst, and Katherine's cold indifference was the only water he wanted. He quietly paid off her landlord through a shell company. He ensured the health inspector left the diner alone. He was dismantling the very cages he had built for her, desperately hoping she would look at him with something other than pity. The reckoning arrived on a freezing Thursday night. The diner was empty, except for Amos and a young cook sleeping in the back office. The rain was lashing against the plate glass windows. Bea was at the register, counting the till, her thick thighs pressing comfortably against the wooden counter. "You're wasting your time, Amos," Bea finally said, not looking up from a stack of $10 bills. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 21 days. Amos's breath caught in his throat. "Am I? I'm not a stray dog you can wear down by leaving food on the porch," she said, slamming the register shut. She turned to face him, her hands on her wide hips. "I know you paid my rent. I know you had the debt collectors stop calling. Stop. I hurt you," Amos said, his voice dropping, lacking its usual arrogant venom. He stared at her hands, imagining what they felt like. "I was a cruel, arrogant bastard, and I am trying to fix it." "You can't fix what you didn't break," Bea said simply. "You didn't break me, Amos. You just proved you were hollow." Before Amos could respond, the screech of tires tore through the rain. 3 black SUVs skidded to a halt outside the diner, boxing in Amos's solitary Lincoln. Amos's instincts flared. He stood up, reaching for the Glock tucked into his waistband, just as the diner's front windows exploded inward in a hail of automatic gunfire. "Get down!" Amos roared. Glass shattered into a million diamond-like shards, raining over the vinyl booths. The espresso machine took a hit, bursting into a cloud of scalding steam. Amos returned fire, taking down the first 2 men who kicked through the shattered doorway, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. Mickey Callahan stepped through the frame, a cruel smile on his face, leveling a sawed-off shotgun. He fired. The blast caught Amos in the right shoulder and side, throwing him backward violently. He slammed into the counter and collapsed against the tiled floor, his gun skittering out of reach. His charcoal suit immediately began soaking with dark, heavy blood. Callahan chuckled, stepping over the glass. "Look at the great Costello, dying in a grease trap." He racked the shotgun. "Any last words, Dom?" Callahan never got to hear them. From the shadows behind the counter, Bea lunged. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She was a woman who had worked on her feet her entire life, carrying heavy trays and hauling kegs. She grabbed the massive, heavy cast-iron pot of boiling oil from the fry station and hurled it directly at Callahan's chest. The Irish mobster screamed in agony as the scalding oil melted through his leather jacket, dropping his shotgun as he clawed blindly at his face. "Amos, move!" Bea barked. She didn't wait for him. Amos was a heavy man, dead weight on the slippery tiles, but Bea's solid, thick frame gave her a center of gravity a smaller woman wouldn't possess. She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit, planted her sturdy legs, and hoisted him up, dragging him forcefully behind the steel reinforcement of the prep counter, just as Callahan's remaining thugs unleashed another volley of bullets. "Call Lorenzo," Bea ordered, ripping her apron off. She didn't panic. Her father had been a combat medic in the army. She knew the mechanics of human survival. Amos, pale and gasping, fumbled for his phone with his good hand while Bea tore his shirt open. The wound was deep, arterial blood pulsing with his heartbeat. She shoved her apron directly into the bullet hole, throwing her entire, substantial body weight onto his shoulder to apply maximum pressure. "You're going to be okay," Bea said, her face inches from his, her chest heaving, but her eyes terrifyingly calm. "Keep pressure on this." "Bea!" Amos choked out, coughing up a speck of blood. He looked up at her, ignoring the gunfire chewing up the diner around them. He didn't see a fat waitress. He saw a titan. He saw an absolute goddess of war and survival. "You stayed. Shut up and bleed quietly," she snapped, pressing harder. "I'm not letting you die on my shift. The paperwork is a nightmare." 2 minutes later, the roar of Costello Syndicate reinforcements flooded the street. Lorenzo and a dozen heavily armed men stormed the diner, wiping out Callahan's crew in a brutal, efficient slaughter. Lorenzo vaulted over the counter, his face pale when he saw his boss in a pool of blood. "Don Costello, we need an ambulance." "No," Amos rasped, gripping Bea's wrist with surprising strength. "The safe house in Back Bay. Take us there. We have a doctor." He looked at Bea, his dark eyes desperate, entirely stripped of his power. "Please come with me. Please, Katherine." Bea looked at the ruined diner, her bloody hands, and then down at the ruthless Mafia boss, begging for her presence like a dying man asking for absolution. She sighed. "Fine. But you're paying for my ruined shoes." The recovery took a month. The Costello safe house was a sprawling, ultra-modern fortress hidden in the heart of Boston's Back Bay. For the first 2 weeks, Amos was bedridden, fighting off a fever and the massive blood loss. And for 2 weeks, Katherine didn't leave his side. She wasn't his servant. She was his warden. She bullied him into taking his antibiotics, forced him to eat hearty, calorie-dense soups she made from scratch, and scolded his Mafia lieutenants when they tried to talk business while he was resting. Lorenzo, a hardened killer, was terrified of her. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Amos was no longer the untouchable king, and she was no longer the humiliated waitress. The armor was gone. On a quiet Tuesday evening, the snow falling softly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Amos finally sat up in his leather armchair by the fire. He was shirtless, his chest wrapped in white bandages. Bea sat on the velvet sofa opposite him, reading a paperback novel, wearing a pair of his oversized sweatpants and a simple tank top that clung to her heavy curves. Amos couldn't take his eyes off her. "I owe you my life," Amos broke the silence, his voice a low, raspy rumble. Bea turned the page of her book. "Add it to your tab." "I'm serious, Katherine," he said, leaning forward, wincing slightly. "Why did you save me? I humiliated you. I destroyed your livelihood. I mocked your body in front of half the city. You should have let Callahan blow my head off." Bea finally lowered the book. She looked at him, her gaze piercing right through his Mafia bravado. "Because I am not you," Bee said softly. "I don't find joy in destroying people. And because, underneath all that expensive tailoring and cruelty, I realized you're just a profoundly lonely man throwing tantrums to see if anyone will stick around." Amos swallowed hard. His throat felt thick. "I never apologized properly. For that night at Antonelli's." He stood up slowly, ignoring the pain radiating through his shoulder. He walked over to the sofa, and, to Bee's absolute shock, he dropped to his knees on the plush rug, right in front of her. "Amos, what are you doing?" "Your stitches." "Let me speak," he interrupted softly. He reached out with his good hand and gently placed it on her thick, soft thigh. He didn't grab. He worshipped. "I called you names because I was terrified. You walked up to my table, and you were so comfortable in your own skin, so real, that it made me feel like a fraud. I attacked your body because I knew it was beautiful, and I knew a woman with a soul as heavy and substantial as yours would never look twice at a monster like me." Bee's breath hitched. She stared down at the most dangerous man in Boston, kneeling at the feet of a plus-size woman he had once deemed unworthy. "I love every inch of you, Katherine," Amos whispered, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her knee, then her thigh, tracing the curve of her hip. "I love your softness. I love your strength. You dragged me out of hell, and I will spend the rest of my miserable life trying to be a man worthy of standing in your shadow." A tear slipped down Bee's cheek. She had spent her whole life defending her body, hiding it, apologizing for it. And here was a ruthless king, treating it like a sacred temple. She reached out, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, and pulled his face up to hers. When their lips met, it wasn't a tentative spark. It was a wildfire. Amos groaned, pulling her heavy frame down onto the rug with him, desperate to feel the solid, incredible weight of her against him. He worshipped every curve, every roll, every soft expanse of skin, murmuring prayers of devotion against her lips until they were both breathless and undone. 3 months later, the Boston culinary scene received a massive shock. Antonelli's trattoria had mysteriously closed down following a sudden, hostile buyout. Mr. Antonelli had fled to Florida after his investors politely suggested he retire early. On a warm spring evening, a new sign went up on Hanover Street. It was elegantly carved in gold lettering, "Katherine's." Inside, the restaurant was transformed. The aisles were widened, the lighting was warm, and sitting at the corner booth, sipping a glass of sassicaia, was Amos Costello. He watched with a soft, adoring smile as the owner, a stunning, curvy woman in a tailored emerald green dress that accentuated her magnificent hips, commanded the dining room. Bee walked over to his table, a clipboard in hand. She looked down at him, her eyes dancing with authority. "You're in my booth, Mr. Costello," she teased. Amos reached out, taking her hand and kissing her knuckles. "Everything I have is yours, Mayor Regina. The booth, the city, and the man." She smiled, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. Money buys silence, and fear buys compliance. But Amos had learned the hard way that true loyalty and true love belongs only to the woman strong enough to break a Don and rebuild him in her image. Did Bee's epic revenge and ultimate triumph leave you breathless? If you loved watching this fearless, curvy queen break down a ruthless mafia boss and claim her throne, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love fierce underdog heroines and intense romance, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding stories every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done at the diner?